See her coming? There she is.
She's alive?
Yeah.
Time now for Module 5, where we talk about worker bees and drones. And we've already spoiled a lot of this for you. Worker bees, you know, are women, and they're the ones that do all of the work in the hive, including guard the hive. Drones, their only job is to mate with a queen from another hive. A very important job, but still it is their only job. They can't even sting to help guard the hive. But let's start out by talking about the worker bees. They're amazing.
Worker bees live anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on the time of year that they're raised in. Some say that there's a little difference in bees that have to overwinter. They have different fat stores than bees that are summertime worker bees. But bees wear out. The wings wear out on a bee more than anything. They get tattered, and then the bee flies out one day and it might run into something that tears its wing and it can't make it back to the hive and it never comes back. So, the queen continually lays eggs and brood to make replacements for that army of worker bees that do all the work in the hive.
These are the infertile female bees in the hive, and they do all the work to keep the hive going. They gather nectar and make the honey and guard the hive and feed the young and tend to the queen and feed the drones. It must be exhausting. From egg to worker bee takes 21 days, and as soon as they make their way out of their cell, they get right to work. It's important to know that their eggs for just 3 days before they hatch out into larvae, which is that white worm-like state. After 4 days of being a larva, so that makes 7 days in all, their sisters cap them with a paper-like substance that allows some airflow in there, so they develop into adult honeybees. If you see eggs, you know that the queen's been there in the last couple of days. So you'll know that even if you don't find the queen, she's been there. Take a look now with this video of the bee chewing her way out of the cell for the very first time.
Whenever they come out of their cell, they're fully developed and ready to go to work. They may take a little bit of some nourishment and then they go to work.
One of the most neat things that you'll see in a hive is when new workers are getting ready to become field workers is what they call play flights. You'll watch on a sunny afternoon, the bees come out and they'll be flying around in a circle. You say, oh, my hive's going to swarm. It's just the bees taking a play flight, and usually 15 minutes later, they're done playing around, taking their first flight, and back in the hive they go. So it's very neat to watch. It's a good thing because you know that the hive is doing well. You know, it had new workers coming on and they're taking their play flights.
Let's talk about their jobs now. First, a worker bee becomes a housekeeper right away. As soon as she emerges from the cell, she gets to work. Her first job is to clean out her own cell, and then she just starts cleaning out other cells to get them spotless for new eggs and to store nectar and pollen. A beehive is very sanitary, and the bees keep it that way. From days 3 to 12, they become nurse bees, and that's when they tend to the babies, which are the larvae. On average, the nurse bees check a single larva 1,300 times a day. As nurse bees, you already learned that they feed that nutrient-rich royal jelly for a few days to everybody, and then for the entire development stage for the larvae that will become queens. They secrete this royal jelly right from the glands in their head. They feed the brood bee bread, which is a mashup of pollen, the protein, and nectar, the carbohydrates. They feed the larva for 6 days and then seal up the cell so the larva can start developing into adult bees. From day 3 to 16, they become undertakers. Not too glamorous, right? The hive, again, is very sanitary and clean, and so these undertakers remove any bees that have died and take their corpse as far away from the hive as possible. Any brood that are dead or diseased are quickly removed as well, so it doesn't impact the rest of the colony. Then it's time to join the royal court. They become queen attendants. That sounds glamorous. Because Her Royal Highness is unable to tend to her most basic needs by herself, some of the workers do all of these tasks for her. When they're a couple of weeks old, it's time to move on to harder work. They have to receive nectar from the field bees coming back into the hive with food. They'll take that nectar and pollen and then deposit it into the honeycomb cells for food to feed the hive. Some of the bees work in the heating and cooling department as they get their wings working and they become fanners. Fanning helps to control the temperature in the hive and all the humidity in there. The fanning also helps them communicate. They'll fan around the queen pheromone so everybody can know that the queen is there and doing okay. Or they might fan around a warning signal, a pheromone that alerts others to danger in the hive. And they'll also pass around a sweet orientation scent to let everybody know which hive to come back to. I should say in the winter, they can detach their wings from their flight muscles and kind of rub them together, shimmy together to keep warm, kind of like when you're rubbing your hands together in the winter to keep warm. In the winter, the cluster stays together and the bees kind of rotate around each other, and they can keep the hive as high as 90 degrees, even in sub-zero temperatures, keeping that queen warm to prepare her to start laying eggs. Days 12 to 17, it's time to become a wax maker, which is a really important job. They secrete little flakes of beeswax out of their abdomen and they take it and use it to build their house. This is where they will store their pollen and their nectar, and it's where the queen will lay eggs. So this is really the foundation of everything about their house. And what they'll do is they'll take it and they'll chew it and they can shape it into the exact shape of honeycomb. The control bees are the politicians of the hive. They're the ones that kind of vote and make all the decisions, such as when to swarm or when to replace the queen. And this timeline really varies depending on what else is going on. You will get to know the guard bees because they'll be the first ones to come out and say hello when you open up a hive. At about day 18, they become guard bees and their stinger is ready for you. It's the last thing that they'll do before they become forager bees. They guard the hive, not only from you, but from other honeybees trying to rob them of honey or any other insects, or maybe bears or mice trying to get in.
Uh, just before they become foragers, they become guard bees. Their sting sac is venom sacs fully developed, and it's their job to stand in front of the hive and they check the papers. You remember all the movies from World War II? Papers, papers. They check the papers of bees coming in.
They can only sting mammals one time and then they die. They end their career in a big way as a field bee or forager. With her life half over, the worker bee now ventures outside and finds nectar and pollen to bring back for the others. She'll also bring back some water to help control the temperature in the hive. She'll also bring back tree resin, which her sisters will use to make bee glue called propolis to seal up the hive. It is very sticky, and it's why you always need a hive tool to be able to get inside. She'll find a nectar source on a plant or a tree and then suck up the nectar with her tongue, which is sort of like a straw, and it goes right into her honey stomach. And this is very different than her digestive stomach. It's called a honey stomach, so she's not digesting the nectar that she slurped up. She can hold half of her weight in nectar in that honey stomach. They eat the honey for their carbohydrates, and again, the pollen is their protein. She's out there doing the important work of pollination, which is the most important thing honeybees do.
I believe the foraging range on bees to be around 2 miles in the typical condition. They can go 8 miles in some circumstances, but 2 miles is a pretty good range. Well, 2 miles is 4,300 acres or something to that effect. Uh, that's a lot of range. That's a lot of acres. So your yard with a little quarter acre doesn't really amount to too much. But things that you can put in your yard always help a little bit. One of the things that I like to see in the spring for bees for forage is crocuses. Those are one of the first things I'll see bees on in the spring. And by the time you see bees foraging on crocuses, they're getting some pollen, maybe a little bit of nectar. Uh, you say, my colonies are going to make it now.
They're designed to do this perfectly because they're so hairy that all the pollen just sticks right to her. She'll brush it down to her hind legs and create a big ball of pollen and then carry it there in what we call her pollen basket. Some people call it her pollen pants. They will literally work themselves to death. Workers that emerge in the fall can live 6 months, but worker bees that come out and do all the work in the spring will only live 6 weeks. One last thing to talk about when it comes to worker bees is the amazing way that they communicate. They don't have ears. So think about that. We've already talked about how they use their wings to fan around pheromone to check on the queen or to alert their sisters about an intruder. They can also vibrate right on the honeycomb, and their sisters can get signals that way. But the coolest thing is something called a waggle dance. Somehow the forager bees coming back will let their sisters know where the good stuff is, where the good nectar and the pollen is. And they do this by dancing in the shape of a figure eight. The longer the dance goes, the farther away that the nectar source is. And it's all in relation to the sun.
The waggle dance is the way they go one way, the other way, shake their butt, go in a line. And what they're doing, they're telling the bees in the hive, and they'll bring back a sample of what they find, let people test it, and they'll tell the other bees where this nectar source is in relationship to the sun. And they can tell them they have three eyes on top of their head that read ultraviolet through the clouds. So even on an overcast day, they can tell them where it is, and they'll go to it. They'll bring back a little bit of a sample on what they find for the other bees to taste, and they do that all in the dark. Now, when we see it, they're in the light, but when they're doing it, it's in complete darkness.
Think about how amazing that is. The forager bee comes back, knows how to dance out a road map of where their sisters go. The sisters know how to read this, and then they can go find that nectar source for themselves. Isn't that amazing?
So yeah, it's fast. I mean, that's what I love about beekeeping. They're an insect, but they're fascinating.
So there was a lot to cover when it comes to worker bees because they do so much. Now let's talk about the drones. And they don't have a lot of responsibility. I do need to say, I know I joke about it, but drones are really important because that's what keep honeybees going. So we have to give them credit for that. But the drones are the boy bees, and their only responsibility is mating with a queen from a different hive.
There's a drone. It's not very bright. He has big eyes so he can spot a virgin queen, but he's just not good at anything else. He can't sting. If you pick him up, he'll get all flustered and he'll pass out. I mean, he doesn't do anything. People think he defends the hive. He doesn't do anything in the hive. He just wants to go out and, he'll beg for food from that. He can feed himself, but he'd rather have a worker feed him.
Take a look at how different the drones look. They have bigger eyes, and that's an easy way to spot them. They're also a little plumper than the rest of the hive. A lot of new beekeepers think that they're looking at the queen bee when they're really just looking at a big, plump drone.
They're a product of an unfertilized egg. So they only have the genes of the queen. So the idea is to pass the genes of the queen along not some guy that she spent, an afternoon with. Uh, so they'll go out and they hang out in that drone congregation area, and if they stay out there too long, they can literally die on the way home. Because they consume a lot of honey.
Take a look at this drone comb. This is where the queen lays eggs for drones. They're kind of bullet like cells protruding, and it's a sign that these emerging bees will be boys. You do want some of this, just not too much. If you have too much drone comb, you might have a laying worker who is infertile, or maybe you have a queen bee that's a drone layer, and you don't want too much of that because you don't have a workforce if you have all boys.
Bees want a certain amount of drone comb in a hive, and they want about 200 drones in their hive all the time in the summertime, because that's their fail-safe. If their queen dies, they have to be able to have something to mate a new queen to.
We don't really like to have a lot of drones, but for some reason it keeps the bees happy, even if they're not going to swarm. You know, I don't know. I say they like to have somebody to boss around.
We've touched on this before, but just a reminder for you, the drone's only responsibility is to mate with a queen from another hive. And most drones actually never even get that chance. But here's how it works. They race to meet up with a queen, and they meet her in midair and they mate in midair. And when that happens, the drone's testes are ripped apart from his body and he falls dead to the ground.
If he's bragging about how many queens he had last week, he's lying because he's still alive.
For the drones that never are able to successfully mate with a queen from another hive, they have a sad ending too, I have to tell you. As the cold weather draws near, the girl bees decide that they don't want the boy bees around anymore. So they literally force them out of the hive into the cold weather alone. And it just happens one day. Suddenly, it's called Massacre of the Drones, and all of the drones are expelled from the hive. It's because that the boys haven't done any of the work and they're just going to be a drain on the hive, eating all the honey throughout the winter. So the girls just kick them out.
They no longer need them for the season, and they're not going to use resources to feed those drone bees if they don't need them, and they excommunicate them. So
Women are heartless.
yes.
Congratulations, you are now halfway through. So you know where to get bees, where to put bees, the equipment that you need. You know all about the queen bee and the workers and the drones. And now it's time to put it all together in module number 6 when we talk about how to inspect the hive.